First of all, I'd just like to thank the organisers for the invitation to speak here at this MacGill Summer School, and it's always a pleasure to come to Donegal. As an Ulster woman myself, I think everybody recognises that it's probably the most popular county in the country. But, you know, on the issue that we're here to speak on tonight, the economic implications basically of the Lisbon Treaty, while the economic implications of the Lisbon Treaty are indeed a fundamental aspect of the debate, the title of the session tonight, Lisbon, Yes or No, Implications for the Irish Economy, is, I feel, very much in line with the approach that's being pursued by supporters of the treaty who have, since the Irish citizens rejected the Lisbon Treaty in a democratic vote, used psychological scare tactics to try and persuade people to accept the treaty. The current and unprecedented economic crisis brought on by a number of factors, most notably the type of economic approach enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty and the economic mismanagement of by our own politicians, was going to happen regardless of whether we accepted or rejected the Lisbon Treaty, and I have no doubt about that. So scaremongering which implies that our economic crisis is even partly due to our rejection of the Lisbon Treaty, or that it will get worse unless we vote yes, does no service to the debate. This economic argument, which is basically the sole argument of the yes side, will, as the debate continues, be exposed as one of the weakest reasons to support the Lisbon Treaty. It is clear that the very deregulated economic model upon which Lisbon is based is responsible for the international financial collapse. So why adopt a treaty that is founded on a failed economic approach and enshrine that failed economic approach into the treaties of the new European Union that will be established by virtue of the Lisbon Treaty? Personally, I feel it's regrettable that our own political representatives, who are paid to serve us, have dishonestly presented our rejection of the Lisbon Treaty as anti-European. They speak of Ireland not being at the heart of Europe, but are, by their own words, trying to remove us from the very heart with terms such as isolation and disengagement. And I've just listened to some of that, no disrespect, but clearly this kind of scaremongering is not acceptable. They refuse to state the legal reality that, regardless of whether we accept or reject the Lisbon Treaty, we will still be full members of the EU, and that there is no mechanism whereby we can be isolated or cut off from the EU in any way. So Rory's claim that, you know, we'll be using the euro but not have a seat at the central bank and etc., has no basis in reality. It is quite clear there is no mechanism where we can be isolated or cut off in this way. This is legally impossible under the current treaties. In fact, I feel this approach by our own political establishment is the most damaging of all and verges on a treasonous approach to our own nation's interests. The impression been given that our rejection of the Lisbon Treaty will damage our prospects for inward investment is yet another scare tactic that has no basis in reality. You just take, for example, our nearest neighbour, Britain. The fact that Britain is recognised as the most Eurosceptic member state of the EU has not stopped investors there, nor has it affected the beginnings of economic recovery. Furthermore, Norway and Switzerland both rejected membership of the EU, and despite not being at the heart of Europe, these are two of Europe's wealthiest nations. Now, while I'm not advocating non-membership of the EU, it's important to point out that survival outside the EU is not impossible, even if that's not the issue. In fact, Minister Brian Lenihan recently acknowledged membership of the monetary union, allied to an influx in cheap labour from Eastern Europe, played a key part in engineering our economic collapse. While there were other factors there as well, particularly in relation to how Fianna Fáil managed things, this is part of the scenario. And it's completely disingenuous and utterly incomprehensible for them to present these self-serving economic arguments, especially coming from many of the same political elite responsible for the current mess, to argue in support of a political treaty on these kind of economic grounds. To date, those who want to reverse the democratic decision of the Irish people on Lisbon are relying on a background of emotional reaction and fear factors concerning the economy. They keep peddling the message the EU is our lifeboat. Look at what happened to Iceland, etc. But I firmly believe that with a balanced and reasoned debate, people will realise that they have done the right thing by rejecting the Lisbon Treaty, particularly from an economic perspective. And this talk tonight is about the economic angles. And while there are many other areas I would like to cover, I'm just going to focus on that. And I'm not going to talk about what's not in the treaty. I'm going to talk about what is actually in the treaty and what Lisbon is about. And it is not about membership of the EU. It's not about an inferior membership of the EU. It's not about us being cut off from the EU. It's basically about what is entailed within the treaty. And if we look at just a few of the key consequences of the Lisbon Treaty, we can see that unquestioning support is a mistake that will come back to haunt us in the future. Considering our current economic situation, where Ireland will, I believe, be far behind other EU member states in achieving economic recovery, I just wonder, is it wise to accept proposals that give more power and strength to the EU's big states while reducing our own? At present, EU laws are made by a simple majority of member states, that's 14 out of 27, so long as between them they have a qualified majority of 255 votes out of 345. And under the Nice system, the big states had 29 votes each and Ireland had 7, a quarter of the big states. Under Lisbon, future EU laws would be made by 55% of member states, that's 15 out of 27, so long as they have a 65% of the total population between them. By basing EU laws primarily on population size, the Lisbon Treaty will over double actually Germany's relative voting strength in the Council of Ministers from the present 8% to 17% on population basis, and increase France, Britain's and Italy's by half, from 8% to 12%, while, interestingly enough, over halving Ireland's vote from 2% to under 1%, 0.8% is what we will have. How does having 0.8% of a vote in making EU laws put us at the heart of Europe? Taoiseach Brian Cowen's guarantees do not explain how having half as much influence in the new EU as Ireland has today would induce other member states to listen to our concerns on the economy, unemployment, etc., and help to resolve our economic crisis in the interests of Irish companies or Irish workers. Now, I also wonder if it's prudent, especially in the current climate of unemployment and threats to wages and working conditions, to copper fasten the Laval and other related judgments, similar judgments of the European Court of Justice, which puts competition of the EU Court of Justice, which puts competition rules of the EU market above the rights of trade unions to enforce pay standards higher than the minimum wage for migrant workers. At the same time, Lisbon would give the EU full control over immigration policy. Now, this combination threatens the pay and working conditions of many Irish people and provides an opportunity for the exploitation of non-Irish people. A protocol in the new EU treaty, different from Lisbon, would be needed to set aside the recent Laval, Rupert and other European Court of Justice judgments. But EU Prime Ministers refused point blank to do that, and Ireland, despite having an opportunity to bargain, did not push for this, or indeed for any changes to the treaties or any protocols. Only a promised protocol at a later date on an insignificant so-called interpretation of the treaty. Now, looking at Ireland's long-term interests, we need to ask, is it wise to agree to amend the existing EU treaties to give the EU exclusive powers as regards rules on foreign direct investment, and to give the EU Court of Justice the power over the harmonisation of national indirect taxes if it decides that they cause, and I quote from the treaty, distortion of competition in the EU market? This amendment and a new protocol number 27 of the Lisbon Treaty on the internal market and competition would strengthen the hands of the EU Court of Justice in using the EU's internal market rules to subvert Ireland's low 12.5% company tax rate, which is the principal reason foreign firms come to Ireland and stay here when they do come. Now, you compare Germany's 30% company tax rate. Commission plans for a harmonised tax base in the EU, the precursor of harmonised tax rates, have been put, and it's been said, have been put on the back burner until after Lisbon II for fear they would alarm Irish voters. And you have to ask the questions. Every single word in the Lisbon Treaty is there for a purpose. It's not to fill up blank pages. It has a reason. It has a legal consequences, and this is being overlooked by our political establishment. And once we agree to Lisbon, there is no way Irish people can prevent what some EU states, in particular Germany, are pushing for, their long-desired harmonised tax base. There is no legally binding protocols, nor were any discussed or demanded to protect Ireland from the implications of this when and if it happens. Should we endorse a treaty that allows the post-Lisbon EU to impose European-wide taxes directly on us for the first time without need for future treaties or referenda? During the last referendum, very little attention was paid to the fact that the European Union could be financed from its own resources under the heading "the Union's own resources." The European Union would provide itself with the means necessary to obtain its objectives and carry through its policies, and it could also establish new categories of own resources through these measures, though these measures would require unanimity in the Council and would not enter into force until they are approved by the Member States in accordance with the respective constitutional requirements. It is clear that it opens the way for an EU taxation system which would make EU budget wholly independent of its member states. And I will just quote from the treaty, this is not make-believe. The Union shall provide itself with the means necessary to attain its objectives and carry through its policies. The Council, acting in accordance with a special legislative procedure, shall unanimously and after consulting the European Parliament adopt a decision laying down the provisions relating to the system of own resources of the Union. In this context, it may establish new categories of own resources or abolish existing categories. That decision shall not enter into force until it is approved by the Member States in accordance with the respective constitutional requirements, which of course I'll come back later. Some will argue, oh well, it has to be unanimous and it has to be via our constitutional requirements. This article would allow EU Council of Ministers to finance the attainment of new European Union the new European Union's very wide objectives established under Lisbon by means of new categories of own resources. These could include virtually any kind of tax: income tax, sales tax, company tax, property tax, carbon tax, any tax, so long as it was unanimously agreed and approved by the Member States in accordance with the respective constitutional requirements, which in Ireland's case, if the Lisbon Treaty is ratified, would mean majority Dáil approval. Now, we all know what majority Dáil approval would give us today. If we had a vote in the Dáil on the Lisbon Treaty, we wouldn't even be having a referendum. If we didn't have to have one because of our own constitution, it would go through. So the Lisbon Treaty would therefore give permission to the Taoiseach and government to agree to various EU taxes in the future without having to come back to the Irish people in a referendum. And it is unlikely that the EU Prime Ministers and Presidents would resist for very long the possibility of endowing the new European Union that they would be running with its own tax resources. Such provisions, and I was not going to go into the military aspect, but I just want to mention this, such provisions as, and I quote, "the common foreign and security policy shall be put into effect by the High Representatives and the Member States by using national and Union resources." Now, this is especially worrying. At present, Irish personnel on EU missions, unlike UN missions, are paid for by the Irish taxpayer. And with the expansion of the common foreign and security policy, this burden is likely to increase substantially. So I think people should think seriously about that. Another issue is just, because this is all relevant to the economy and the economic implications for Ireland, company tax. Article 93 of the Lisbon Treaty proposes an important amendment, again, not just there as window dressing or to fill up pages, it's there for a purpose, and it was well thought out by Giscard d'Estaing and other people at the Convention. This amendment, Article 113 of the Consolidated Treaties, which at present makes harmonised company taxes laws across the EU mandatory requirement, although that must be done by unanimity. This amendment states that such harmonisation must take place if it is necessary to avoid distortion of competition, allowing a country or business firm to take a case before the EU Court of Justice alleging that, for example, and this is where it's out of our control, where a company or a business or whatever can go to the European Court and argue that Ireland's 12.5% tax rate of company tax constitutes a distortion of competition, as compared with Germany's 30% rate. It would then be open to the European Court to apply the EU's internal market rules in competition matters to issues of company taxation. The court could then require member states to harmonise their company taxes over a specific period of time, although governments would still decide the actual rates. That's clear. Lisbon would therefore open a clear way around the present unanimity requirement for matters of company taxes. And there is another method in that what's called the escalator clause in Article 48 of the Lisbon Treaty. This could be applied to the new Article 93 of the Lisbon Treaty on the functioning of the Union, and I'll just quote from the treaty. It says, "The Council shall, acting unanimously on a proposal from the Commission and after consulting the European Parliament and the Economic and Social Affairs Committee, adopt provisions for the harmonisation of legislation concerning turnover taxes, excise duties and other forms of indirect taxation to the extent that such harmonisation is necessary to ensure the establishment and the functioning of the internal market and to avoid distortion of competition." That national difference in company taxes constitutes, distortion of competition. This would undoubtedly be the main argument after Lisbon for harmonising indirect taxes on companies, an issue that is especially sensitive, I think, here in Ireland. The mandatory shall adopt makes it clear that there would be an obligation on member states to harmonise company taxes, even though there is now a requirement of unanimity. And the unanimity, I think we have to be very careful about, because unanimity means that our own ministers have to agree, which is what the government and the establishment here are arguing. But we only have to look at what has Ireland not agreed to. When they complain about the people who've said no all the time, but when have they ever said, hold on? They've said yes to everything. Again, you have to question this and wonder, you're putting all of your trust in future political representatives, future ministers and future Taoiseach. I'm just probably going to run out of time, am I? Or am I? Okay. I just wanted to touch on one other issue first, because I think it's also important. It's just in relation to the kind of economic policies that are enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty. And I don't think it bodes well for those campaigning for a different type of economic approach that puts people, the environment and the interests of the poor and exploited peoples of this world before profit and greed. With the Lisbon Treaty, neoliberalism would become EU economic policy. The principle of an open market economy with free competition is reinforced by the fact that the internal market, as set out in Article 3 of the Treaty on European Union, includes a system ensuring that competition is not distorted. So undistorted competition would become one of the European Union's organising principles. And I think anyone concerned about trade and development and the issue of the majority world needs to look clearly at the Lisbon Treaty and its implications. And I firmly believe that when all the consequences of the Lisbon Treaty are independently examined, it will be clear that the treaty should be rejected so that another Europe is possible. There are democracy movements right throughout Europe waiting for the Irish people to say no. And I think it was Rory Quinn said, telling the rest of European citizens that they can't go forward. We are the only country in Europe that have been given a vote on this. Two of the other countries that were given a vote on it, two of the founding members of the EU that were given a vote on it in its original format, the EU Constitution, said no. What happened when they said no? They took it back in the reform and formulated it, put it back out again, said to those two countries, oh, you don't need to vote on this. And Sarkozy openly admitted, oh, we can't let our people vote on this, they're going to reject it. So to claim that Ireland is stopping the other citizens in Europe from going forward is absolute nonsense. Yes, Ireland is definitely stopping some people from doing what they want, and that's the political elite in Europe who have conspired against their own citizens to prevent them from having a say in the direction Europe is going in. And I found one of the most interesting slogans that I have got from people across Europe, pro-democracy movements and citizens groups and people working for the developing world, and one of them is Europe. And this is the other thing, this is not anti-Europe, this is pro-Europe. It's a Europe where people come first, where the interests of the political elite in Europe do not take priority over the interests of ordinary people. And the quote is, or their slogan is, Europe, not without the people. And that's exactly what it's all about. It should be Europe with the people. Let the people have a say. You can't railroad over the people. And one thing I think we have to be clear about, whether we say yes or no, the economic consequences in Ireland will not be affected despite the scaremongering. And as a few examples that I've shown, that will not be the case. And the same political leaders in this country who have squandered an economic opportunity and who have driven this country economically into the ground are the same ones who are asking you to trust them. Trust us. There is nothing in the Lisbon Treaty that will affect anything you're concerned about. They come back with a list of declarations that are not legally binding in the same way that the treaty is, and they say, accept this. They didn't even look for protocols, because they knew if they looked for protocols, they would have to go back to the other countries, and the citizens of Europe, right across the board, opinion polls have shown it, they would say no if they had the opportunity. This is pro-Europe, to say, hold on, we want a Europe that's based on democracy and the interests of the people and the rights of the people and the say of the people. And I'm just going to finish with a quote from a former party colleague when I was in the Green Party, who said of the EU Constitution, and as it was called then, as you know now, it's called the Lisbon Treaty. And they said, certainly, while the easier political option for the European Greens might be to support the draft EU Constitution and win the favour of the political and business classes across Europe, and of course here in Ireland, ultimately we have to be true to our own political belief system and our distinctive political agenda. Otherwise, as a transnational political movement, we do not deserve the support of our own domestic electorate, nor of the wider European public. And I think that says it all. We have to speak up for all the people who have been deliberately silenced. This is about democracy. This is about the will of the people. This is not about what the political elite of Europe want. And I know I'm in a complete minority here tonight, so I just hope that you will even take in some of what I said and check some of the text of the treaty. I deliberately quoted directly from the treaty so that I can't be accused of making it up. Thank you.